Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode in store for you with a very special guest, a great friend and a great coach, Mr. Jordan Shelley. Jordan is the head coach at WIT, where Rob and I have both done a lot of work, and Rob goes even further back to, I think, nurturing Jordan into his early stages of his fitness career many years ago. So in this episode, we talk a lot about Jordan's experience with training for ultramarathons and how many CrossFitters are missing out on potential benefits of more monostructural training, and how the mixed modal implementation of many CrossFit programs can actually mean you're leaving a lot of gains on the table. So tune in all the way to the end. There's plenty of nuggets of information to extract from this one. But before we get into it, don't forget to click the link in the description below to register your interest and get some Lunge and Lift listener exclusive bonuses for Rob's strength formula, which is your answer to the strength and muscle building equation. Also, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website to get your free Vital Principles of Movement Mechanics guide. Also, thank you to WIT-Fitness. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your WIT kit. And Hytro, use our discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, let's get into it. Jordan, welcome to the show. How are you doing, mate?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I've been a long-standing fan of the show. It's kept me company through a lot of long runs, so it's an honor to finally be on it.
Thanks for coming on,
Glad
mate.
to hear it, mate. And could you just give us a quick background intro on who you are and what you do, please?
So I am currently the head coach at WIT London. Known both of you guys for a long time, so sort of trained in WIT for a very long time. Trained with Rob actually even earlier than that, before back in the Virgin Active days. So started off as a personal trainer. From uni, went straight into PT, sort of bypassed. Did I say uni?
Yeah,
So from
that's
college,
good.
sorry, went straight to PT and bypassed uni is what I meant to say. So yeah, just went straight into training that way and sort of developed through that. Got very interested in strength and conditioning, and then later on down the line in CrossFit as well. Dabbled in CrossFit myself a little bit, but sort of found my way eventually in running. So a bit of a runner now. Started off actually sprinting when I was very young, and now I'm tackling an ultramarathon. So sort of come a very big roundabout circle to get there really. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome, mate. And it's not just a normal ultramarathon. Tell us about the ultra you're training for, mate.
Yeah, so it's 100 kilometers. It's up in Oxfordshire. It's called Race to the Stones. So 100 kilometers from somewhere in, as I said, in Oxfordshire along the Ridgeway. It's like a very historic route. Apparently, I don't really know much about it. I've sort of just signed up and I said, yeah, all right, let's give it a go. But it's quite a challenge for me, as the longest I've ever run, well, now is about 27K, but prior to that, race wise, is a half marathon. So I've kind of jumped into the deep end a little bit. So yeah, it's proving quite challenging. It's definitely taxing training wise, but also just a bit of a shock on the body, and just really getting used to that.
What does training look like for like an ultra? Like, are you doing intervals? Are you doing like long distance? Like, is it just you got to pick up the miles in the legs? Like, what is it?
Yeah, so the vast majority of it is sort of just volume accumulation, and getting time on feet. Obviously, going from all of the training I've done previously, I'll have a fair bit of let's say fitness. I'm going to use that very vaguely. I'm going to use that quite broadly, because that fitness is not very transferable to an ultra marathon, and that's more just because a lot of the time is spent at quite low heart rate. It's spent at sort of zone two, if you would. But most of the conditioning, most of the training I'm doing now is just conditioning the body to be very good at spending that much time on my feet, being good at utilizing fuel, as well. So a lot of my training now is just trying to not shit myself whilst running, basically, and sort of a bit of a trial and error with food to see what I can tolerate whilst spending that much time on my feet. So yeah, it's a very different training methodology. Sorry, and obviously, as I said, coming from a background of sprinting where it's almost the complete opposite, it's yeah, it's quite difficult. It's mentally very challenging as well. Um, so yeah, a lot of it is just conditioning to the non-physical side of running for that long. Um,
So
yeah.
is it all running you're doing, or are you doing any like say bike work? So you're getting like off feet time, like building up an aerobic base there. And I take it you're, as you said, you're kind of getting your body accustomed to eating while you're training, which is obviously
Mm.
great when you're like a weightlifter slash powerlifter. You know, your Haribo's mid set, but like I guess doing it in your long distance run, fueling is obviously going to be massively key. So I guess as you say, you're trying to condition your gut to essentially be able to take on a lot of carbohydrates and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I'm doing some sort of bike work, but mainly just to uh, not get injured. Like there's been a few niggles that have popped up over the last few weeks, especially, which have kind of prevented me from getting as much volume on feet as I'd like. But essentially, in my eyes, I want to try and get as much time on my feet as possible. The more running I can do, the better. So the only reason I would really use the bike is if I can't run. Um, but that's becoming more and more prevalent. So I'm starting to spend a bit more time on the bike now, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, I'm using that to sort of subsidize where I can't run. Um,
Mm.
but a lot of it is, yeah, just trying to run as much as possible. There's some strength training involved as well, a lot less than I assumed I would be doing right at the start. Um, but yeah, a lot of it is just trying to build some volume, trying to get some long runs in. A lot of it is just based on time rather than a specific pace, and just staying at a reasonable heart rate, really.
Why is there less strength training? Is that just because the runs are taking so much out of you? You don't have energy to do the strength stuff.
Pretty much. Also, just with time, like I don't really find too much time to get them in. I also just had to have a word with myself as well because I think coming from again a background of doing a lot of strength training, I've been so used to that sort of frequency of strength training that it feels a bit weird dropping down to like 2 sessions a week, let's say. But it's it's a really odd discipline, sort of going into ultra running, where the vast majority of it, as I said, is just trying to spend time running and spend more time doing that. So what do I really need to be that strong for? I need to be strong
Mm-hmm.
enough to run 100 kilometers, but no stronger. That's the key thing I had to really tell myself, and that's been a difficult pill to swallow. I think just because I've come from a background of 5 6 strength sessions a week, um, and then cutting that down to just being strong enough to run, but
Mm.
not needing to be any stronger, or certainly not any bigger than that.
Awesome. So, one of the reasons we wanted to get you on today, we've had a few great chats about monostructural work in CrossFit, and you've obviously got a lot of experience on top of your ultra running in programming for WIT for individual athletes. And could you give us a little overview as to your thoughts on how monostructural work should be built into CrossFit training?
Yeah. So we were speaking a bit about this just before we came on. I think one of the main things that CrossFitters do really well is putting time to their training. They can train a lot. They train incredibly hard a lot of the time. Um, but and I'll explain why I think this. I think CrossFitters can be incredibly lazy at the same time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they can really hide behind the idea of mixed modal work or mixed modal training to not look at certain areas of weakness. And I don't mean that in the sense of, a specific movement might be weak, but just a complete area of training or facet of training might be really overlooked and then just not developed very well in their training. And I think with mixed modal work, you look at a classic CrossFit workout, there are a lot of ways that you can hide behind a workout to defend maybe, not being fit enough or not being strong enough or robust enough for a specific kind of workout. You can hide behind a lot of different areas of that.
100%. Completely agree. And could you bring that to light a little bit more? Like what would be a typical example you see of the type of deficiency an athlete might have and how they might mask it in a mixed modal workout?
Yeah. So, for example, if we're talking about just straight up fitness and how fit someone is, and we'll take like a 20-minute AMRAP or something like that as an example. It's quite a commonly used format in CrossFit. If someone's just not very aerobically fit within that time domain, they can't sort of tolerate the demands of that. It's quite easy to look like you're still fit enough if there are certain movements within that you are maybe just quite good at, and you can move quite efficiently on them, but you're probably not moving anywhere near as quickly as you could if you were just a bit fitter. And I think, that's just one of the things that people tend to hide behind a little bit, is the fact that there's so much variation in their program that they never really get enough time to focus on one thing specifically and really build that out and really develop on that as an area. And they end up just doing a bit too much of everything and not really enough of one particular thing to make them a better athlete.
I do think when it comes to fitness, and this is coming from personal experience, like fitness for me is the area of, say, CrossFit that I was never as good as compared to, say, the strength side. So I was always able to hide behind, short, sharp workouts. I'm strong enough. I can kind of get through. And then maybe along the journey, I kind of got better at understanding how to use my body so I can kind of not game it, but like work to my strengths, and then my weaknesses weren't as bad. Maybe I might row at a less intense pace to kind of get the work done, but I could definitely row faster to get better scores. And I think because fitness is essentially, it's not as cool to work on, like strength training, you got numbers, it's barbells, you're in the gym, whereas fitness is a lot of repeatable efforts doing the same shit, and which people could say about the barbell, but as someone that's a lot more of a strength enthusiast, thinking about just doing a load of, say, cardio intervals doesn't necessarily always appeal to me. So it's a really easy one to hide behind. I'll just be the strong guy. And like I used to say, I used to be called Red Line Rob because I'd just go out hard and then not be able to handle it. It's like, well, because you had no fucking game plan. You just went out hard and then just had to hold on, even though my heart rate generally does go higher and I do stay higher. Like, it was a really easy thing to hide behind. So it's like when you say these things, it really does hit home with me, because I can pull myself out and see that throughout my CrossFit, say, career, whatever that was, I definitely had that as my kind of go-to, that, I'm just not the fit one, I'm the strong one. Ugh.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what I mean by, CrossFitters being lazy. I said they're incredibly hardworking. I'll never not say that. They, out of anyone I know, they probably spend the most time dedicating themselves to, a particular part of their life. And CrossFitters are, as I'm sure you guys know as well, almost always very focused, very almost obsessed with CrossFit and really trying to get better. But they will just do CrossFit workouts and they won't see how, spending a particular amount of time or a phase going through one area of work would really make them better. And identifying those weaknesses isn't just as simple as putting more frequency into a program. It's more about, let's actually use some time to build a periodized, progressive plan to get you better at this facet of training. And again, I used this example previously, where we look at any other sport and you just wouldn't be able to hide behind not being good at a certain thing and ignoring it. You take again, I used this example before, you take a sprinter, let's say, Usain Bolt wasn't very good at his starts. He wouldn't just turn up to training one day and be like, I'm not good at starts, so I'm just not going to do them today. That would be something that was really built into his program and really developed because it's a weakness, and it wouldn't just be put into mixed modal work. You would never really see that in any other in any other sport discipline where you'd be like, okay, well, let's do this, but at the same time, let's work on, you know, your plyometrics or something else, or you try and merge them together. Let's just actually try and build that area of weakness out really strong over the next few weeks or months, even, to make you a more rounded athlete.
Yeah, spot on. And I think the focus we want for today is basically on the monostructural stuff. So obviously, if it's identified as a weakness, there's a very clear reason why. Like if your fitness is a weakness, that's one reason why you would do more cardiovascular training. But why else would you do monostructural work when your sport is a mixed modal sport?
So the thing with monostructural work is that it's far more measurable. It's a lot easier to progress, and it's a lot easier to implement progressive overload. I'm not saying that it can't be done through mixed modal work. It certainly can, and there's almost always a place for that in a CrossFitter's training cycle. I think what tends to happen though with a lot of coaches or a lot of athletes is that they'll look at CrossFit competitions as being sort of the goal. They'll look at that as the thing that they're training for, which is easily done because, again, with any other sport, you've got a very clear outline as to what you need to achieve. Again, we take sprinting as an example. Your goal is to run 100 meters as quickly as you can. In CrossFit, it's less easy to define, but there is, you know, the notion of competition, which is ultimately what someone is training for. And I think what coaches tend to do is use that idea of competition as the end goal and try and replicate that through training, which, yes, should be done, but there's a time and place to do that. And I think trying to do that all year round is not only not optimal or suboptimal, it's also, again, quite lazy. It doesn't give the athlete the chance to really progress in any given area. And the thing with mixed modal work is that because it's so different, there's so much variation. Again, you can't measure it half as well as you could a single modality piece of work or block. So it's really easy for the athlete to then just get lost in doing arbitrary amounts of volume one week and then probably not actually seeing that movement again for, say, like another 2 or 3 weeks before they then go back onto that movement. And the rate of progression is then going to be far slower. Let's say you have 60 handstand push-ups, let's say in 1 week of your training, and then, you know, your coach is trying to implement lots of variation. They're doing other movements, and maybe there will be some more push movements. Maybe next week you'll have some push jerks, and the week after that you'll have some strict press. It's then maybe another 3 weeks before you go back to handstand push-ups, and your rate of development is probably going to be far slower than if you were to just be doing a block or a single mode of training. You wouldn't be able to measure it quite as easily, and you'd probably see way less progression in that particular movement or particular training style.
100%. Yeah, that's something I see a lot as well. And that you said it perfectly earlier, in that we're trying to achieve progressive overload. So if you separate the two words, it's got to be progressive and it's got to be overloaded. So if you've got 60 handstand push-ups 1 week, we should be looking to nudge that up week on week. And when there's so much variety, we risk it not being progressive. So you could go from 60 to 120, which is too fast. It's not progressive. Or you could go from 60 to 0 or 60 to 20 or 60 to 30, and then you're no longer overloading that movement. So you can't really expect to develop your ability in handstand push-ups because you've ticked neither the progressive nor the overload components of progressive overload. And it's hard to do. There's so many movements in CrossFit to kind of keep everything on simmer and nudge some things up. There's a lot of component pieces to keep an eye on, which is, I think, more challenging than programming for any other sport, because, you know, sprinting is one thing you got to optimize for, whereas in CrossFit there's so many components. Unless you're elite and you've got loads of training time to play with, trying to squeeze it all in and balance things off is really, really difficult.
I guess that's where the priorities come in, right? Because then again, so like having then as Jordan used the example of having handstand push-ups 1 week, then some push jerks, then some strict press, is in like, if you know you're barbell proficient, you shouldn't be doing the barbell then. You should be focusing on those handstand push-ups over those 3 weeks and trying to then, as you just said there, progress them nicely, just piece by piece. Because as a CrossFitter, we should know what our glaring weaknesses are across the board. And then it's up to us to take the ownership of sucking for a period of time and picking, right, I need to do the gymnastics class if I'm doing classes, or if I'm doing classes and I do some open gym, in my open gym time, I'm going to make sure I'm doing my handstand push-ups week in, week out, because they are a huge weakness of mine. So, because again, if you're a class-based individual, you can then hide behind the fact that, oh, the coach is programming only they come up X, Y, Z. So it's like, well, actually, you've got either a gymnastics class or you've got open gym where you can go and crack on and focus. You can talk to the coach and say, look, this is a weakness of mine. How can I progress? So I think it's just, it's taking ownership of the fact that you're going to suck and then going with it. So then you don't suck anymore.
Yeah. And also just being really honest with how you address that, because you'll hear it a lot in CrossFit as well. The sort of term of working on your weaknesses is quite a token term, and often you'll just see that as, okay, let's say pull-ups are a weakness. They'll just program more pull-ups in to more arbitrarily programmed sessions, and they'll be just as mixed modal. It might be, okay, 1 week you've got an EMOM with double unders and wall balls, and then, okay, next week let's add some pull-ups into that's working on my weaknesses. But it's not, it's just putting something you're not very good at alongside two other things that you're okay at. It's not working on your weaknesses. Working on your weaknesses would be actually dedicating a bit of time to building some strength in pull-ups, whether that be, whatever factor is lacking, whether you're just not strong enough to generate power in that position, or you're not agile enough. It could be quite as simple as, you don't move very well, you don't move your hips very well, and you need to generate a bit more power. And that's a common theme as well. A lot of time people pick apart weaknesses and they'll say, oh, my weaknesses are bar muscle ups or something like that, but they can't do bar muscle ups because they're just not powerful enough. It's as simple as that. And I'll see, and this is actually quite a common thing, I think, with girls in particular in CrossFit, that they'll see some gymnasts. I'll use bar muscle ups as quite a good example, because that's often something that a lot of female CrossFitters will chase quite heavily, and they'll do endless amounts of drills on bar muscle ups, or try and put, floor bar muscle ups or with a box assisted bar muscle up into workouts and things like that. And it's just not working on their weaknesses. It's just trying to drill something that you can't do. It's almost like me taking, if I couldn't snatch 120 kilos, I wouldn't just continue trying to snatch 120 kilos week in, week out and hope that makes me better at it. I'd have to understand what the floor is for that, what I'm doing inadequately, and try and build that as a system. And again, we take bar muscle ups as the example there. For the vast majority of the time, you see these people trying to do bar muscle ups and carry on trying and doing every drill under the sun. Yeah, you don't get me wrong, you'll definitely get some value from them. You'll get some benefit from doing these drills. But the bottom line is they're probably just not powerful enough. They can't get their hips to the bar. And if they could get their hips to the bar, they'd quite easily be able to do a bar muscle up. I was talking about this with someone I trained actually a couple of weeks ago, and I used Chris Speed as an example. And Chris Speed is, for anyone listening who doesn't know, he's actually been on the podcast. He's a fantastic weightlifter, an incredibly powerful man. He literally, every time I see him move, if you blink, you will miss him move. He's very fast. Yeah. He's very, very powerful. And I've seen that man do bar muscle ups like it's nothing. And the rig shakes because he moves so quickly over the bar. He is not a gymnast. He doesn't practice bar muscle ups, and he doesn't regularly practice bar muscle ups. He's just powerful as shit. So when he gets onto a bar and he wants to try and get his hips over the bar, they go over the bar because he can just move his hips that well. And that comes down to the fact that he is trained in a single modality sport. He's trained in weightlifting at a very good level. He's obviously very gifted at that, don't get me wrong. But he's obviously developed quite a lot over his training in weightlifting, to the point where his hips are powerful enough for that skill to cross over really, really effectively into a bar muscle up. And that's where I think single modality sport or training can really be beneficial for the CrossFitter, where you look at systems rather than specific movements. And if you want to develop one thing, that the rate of improvement over that training block by training one specific mode will give you far more benefit than just trying to put everything together all at once and trying to amalgamate lots of different training methods.
I think that is the art of programming and coaching CrossFit. Is obviously you make more faster progress by doing things in isolation, but at some point you've got to bring it back together to compete in the sport. What are your thoughts on when and how you should do that? Like, because, say there's 40 movements in the CrossFit Open. If you do 40 mini blocks across your training week or 2 weeks, however you split it, you touch them all kind of in isolation. At what stage would you start reintegrating them? How do you go about that process?
Yeah, it really depends. It depends what you're training for, what the end goal is. Let's say that end goal is a competition, and you need to then, as you say, sort of tie everything back into making sure that you're fit enough and you're prepared enough to be doing those mixed modal stuff. Again, I'll caveat everything I'm saying by, mixed modal training is incredibly important if you're a CrossFitter. It's the bread and butter. It's very, very important if you want to go to that point where, or just generally, if you want to do CrossFit at all, you need to be able to do mixed modal stuff very well. Absolutely. I think there is a limited amount of time, though, in which you can progress through doing mixed modal work. And you won't be able to get as much bang for your buck doing mixed modal conditioning, let's say, in the space of 3 months compared to doing a single modality or a couple of carefully chosen modes for 3 months. And I think it depends on the history of the athlete and how proficient they are in certain movements or in mixed modal training generally. I'll use myself as an example. I by no means consider myself as a competitive CrossFitter, but I like to do strength and depth, the 12-man team, every year just because it's great fun. I just love doing it. And I usually go into a bit of a CrossFit block where I do lots of mixed modal work, and I do lots of sort of typical CrossFit workouts, probably about 3 months before the competition. Maybe a little bit more than that. But I spend the vast majority of the year just focusing on one element of training. And obviously at the moment that's running. That's just becoming pretty fit as a runner. And I won't use this training block as an example, but I'll use a couple of years ago when I was training for an ultra marathon. This was kind of my first time getting into the world of running, where I actually trained as a runner for an extended period of time, bar sprinting. Obviously, I'm sort of separating the two. And I spent 8 months not doing any CrossFit. I came back to CrossFit just before about 3 months before the competition. And after about 2 weeks of training, I was far better at CrossFit than I ever had been. And that's just because I was fitter, I was a better athlete, and I knew how to manage a lot of the stuff that comes up in CrossFit. At the end of the day, CrossFit is quite an easy thing to get your head around because it's very, very stimulating. There's a lot going on. There's always something new coming up in training. So it's very exciting. It's very interesting. Running is the exact opposite of that. And there are times in that half marathon training block where I just have to run pretty much at threshold for an hour. And it hurts from about 3 minutes in and doesn't stop hurting until about 3 minutes after. And that is difficult training. I'm not saying CrossFit isn't difficult. Don't get me wrong. You can really, really hurt in CrossFit, but that is boring as fuck. When you're running for that long at that kind of intensity, you learn a lot about yourself as an athlete, and you learn a lot about having to manage pain, having to manage your heart rate and different things and things that just pop up into your head. And I don't want to sort of undermine, some of the training that I did after that, but coming into a CrossFit workout after that, I'd be hurting about 5 minutes in and be like, this is a piece of piss. Yeah. I can do this all day. This is nothing. Because I had that mental resilience. I had a lot also was just physically fitter as well. I built up a lot of tendon strength and conditioning through the lower body, which made me very very good at coping with all of the physiological symptoms of that kind of training as well, and being at that kind of heart rate for a period of time. So I was also just physically fitter, and because I had a history of training CrossFit before that, and I was relatively proficient at these movements, I went back into training at a decent level for myself anyway, very, very quickly. And I was undoubtedly a better CrossFit athlete after doing that 8 months of running. Now, I'm not saying that that's obviously the only way of training. And obviously, if you were to compare that to, if you'd say, okay, well, Jordan, what about if you did 8 months of CrossFit? It's impossible to tell you what the answer would be there. But I certainly wouldn't have been able to make as much gains in one particular area as I would have if I was just doing CrossFit and mixed modal work for that 8 months. I would have probably gained a few extra little bits in some areas, some facets of training, but I would never have developed maybe my cardio work or my lower limb resilience quite as much as I would have in that training block. And maybe that was a weakness of mine, maybe it wasn't, but I developed that so much that it was a real shift in my training afterwards.
I definitely can sympathize with that, because I remember when I went through my cycling phase, and like the sitting uncomfortably in your threshold pace, like where your heart rate's high and you just have to endure that discomfort. That it is, when you come back to CrossFit, it's more just about greasing the groove of movement patterns, because the weights a lot of the time aren't actually that heavy. 22.5 kilo dumbbells, like that's nothing really. And then you're talking about gymnastic movements, which again is your body weight, which you're greasing that groove. That when you've got that base level of fitness that you're coming in with, you can really use that, because as you said, it becomes then nothing. You've got a 20-minute workout and 5 minutes in, you're like, okay, this hurts a little bit, but it's not too bad. So I can definitely empathize with that, because it's, again, when you said about how the laziness is being able to go and do a workout where you just endure discomfort for a long period of time, it's you're hiding behind not wanting to do these things. And then, but you say your fruits of your labor really come to fruition there, because then you come back and you was able to just get back into everything and learn how to CrossFit again, essentially, because it's not that hard if you've already been doing it, because it's just remembering how to move. Same as when I did weightlifting recently. It's like, if I gave myself more time, it would have been better, but I got back into being able to move a barbell relatively proficiently quite quickly, and it was then just tweak this, tweak that, tweak this, tweak that, and it's just in my absolute strength, which didn't come back as quick as I'd hoped.
Is that what you put it down to, Jordan? The fact that when you took the time off to focus on running, it was just the objective progressive overload that enabled you to build your engine far more effectively than you would have done with all the variation that normally is in a CrossFit program?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think there's any sort of magic in any particular mode of training. That it could have been cycling, it could have been anything. I think there's a particular distaste towards running in a CrossFit community for some weird reason, which I'll never understand. People, like CrossFitters that say, oh, I don't run, or I won't do running, again, I think fall into that, I'd say again, but into that lazy category, where it's like, you shouldn't do that. If you want to be a good CrossFitter, then the idea is that you are good at everything, and there shouldn't be anything that you hide from or just completely turn your back on. If a new movement was to come up, the crossover singles or whatever, any obscure movement that comes up, people always go ahead and try them. Just because it's hard shouldn't be, or boring, shouldn't be a reason that you avoid that. If you want to be a good CrossFitter, you really need to be able to be good at running. Like it's such a fundamental movement. I think it's really quite strange when people end up saying that they just don't run because they like doing CrossFit. So yeah, I'd never understand that. But to go back to your point, absolutely, I think it's the nature of being able to implement progressive overload for such an extended period of time that made me a better athlete. And at the end of the day, if you're not progressing or overloading, to sort of make it really crude again, you're not going to get better. You might pick up little things here and there, but you're not going to do it in any sort of reasonable period of time. And if you're just constantly varying what you're doing with training, then you're going to constantly vary how much you get out of that as well. You're never really going to be able to measure how much better you're getting, and you're certainly not going to be able to do that in a particular manner of time. And again, if we go back to my example of just running for 8 months, I don't think that's an optimal way to get better at CrossFit. I don't think you should just run for 8 months and that's going to make you better at CrossFit. As a caveat there, I do think, however, you could spend a significant period of time looking at one mode of training as your dominant mode, maybe working on a few other things that would complement that, and maybe fit into that training cycle quite easily and complement each other well, and then spend another period of time looking at a completely different mode of training and really developing that. And I think the way that you're going to get better at being CrossFitter and being good at all of these elements of training is if you give each element the adequate amount of time to develop. That's the sort of the key thing there about single modality training. I don't think that anyone looking to do a mixed modal sport like CrossFit should just be doing single modality training all the time and expect to be good at CrossFit. If you want to be good at ring muscle ups, you're going to have to do ring muscle ups at some point in your life, but you're not going to be less good at ring muscle ups if you get fitter. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. I think one way to kind of make this simpler to visualize is if you look at triathlon. If you're trying to get good at 3 disciplines, triathletes don't always do swim, bike, run in every session. They will separate them out, and they'll separate the components of each discipline. So they'll do shorter and faster, they'll do longer and slower in each of those. Then they'll do some brick sessions when they start to get used to the feeling of going from one into the other. And I think CrossFit is that, just with 40 movements instead of 3, and spending some time working on each discipline separately will benefit the overall performance more than always doing them all together. And why do you think it is that people are averse to that? Because I think for a lot of coaches, this isn't groundbreaking. It's kind of understood in a fundamental level. Is it just because everyone loves novelty, everyone loves variety, they find it more exciting, they don't like the accountability of being told whether they're actually improving or not? Is that what it is?
I think so. I think it does come down to that a lot. I think, and this isn't to knock any coaches, I think there are some really, really good CrossFit coaches out there, and I think there are some really good CrossFit coaches that maybe don't execute it in the way they want to because they're scared. And I'll use that. I think scared is actually quite a good word. They're scared to go down the route of making it too progressive because it looks boring and it doesn't look very attractive to the CrossFitter. And everyone knows that CrossFitters probably have the smallest attention span when it comes to training in comparison to any other athlete, because there's, again, as you said, there are hundreds of movements, and the idea of CrossFit or CrossFit workouts, when you typically think of one, you probably think about 5 different movements and some really strange format which calculates your score at the end of that. And if a workout isn't programmed like that or is seen to be appearing like that throughout a training block, is it any longer CrossFit? And an athlete might look at that and think, hold on, am I training for the right thing here? And I think it's just part of the coach's job to really explain why, they are going into a particular focus or spending a particular amount of time looking at something that maybe looks a little boring or less specific to your typical CrossFit workout there. And it's their job to make sure that the athlete understands, why they're doing that. I think, there's a bit of pressure to make CrossFit workouts look really attractive, make them look really cool. And don't get me wrong, like sometimes I'll glance at a workout and I'll be like, oh yeah, that's a really cool workout. Like that looks fun. But if you were just doing fun workouts 5 days a week, you're not going to get that much better. You will get better. You'll get better if you train anything, to a degree. Like you can throw shit at a wall and a lot of it will stick. But if you really aim well, you can make a lot of it stick, and you can you can really be smart with how you program that. And I think there's an innate fear with CrossFit coaches to make everything look really attractive. And even when they're doing phases in their training, they don't really go in wholeheartedly. They'll sort of say, oh, okay, we're going like a power phase or something like this. And they might put a few more workouts in that are, shorter time domain. They'll look at power output very loosely for that block, but they won't really try and develop it, and they haven't got enough frequency or time in that training block to really develop power. If you want to go into a power phase, make them powerful. Don't just do the same training you're doing all year round with some weightlifting, some gymnastics, and then a few 20-second intervals, scattered on the weekend just because you're in a power phase. That's not a power phase. That's just doing a couple of intervals, and you might do them once a week. But, at the end of that 6-week block, 8-week block, how much more powerful are they really? Marginally, maybe.
Yeah. Steve Fawcett said when he came on that they were playing with this at JST, and they did a 16-week squat cycle where it was very progressive, a little bit repetitive because they obviously were working on it. And everyone was PBing, everyone's squat jumped up by more than it ever had done in any given training block. But the feedback was, it's boring, we don't like doing the same things over and over again. And it's just like, well, what do you want? And I think everyone has a different appetite for variety, for novelty. And this is where the trade-off between effective programming versus enjoyable programming is the balancing act that we have to strike. And it is tough because as a coach, you obviously want the best results, like best objective results for your athletes. But depending on how seriously the athlete takes it, they might actually be willing to take a slower rate of progression for the excitement of, what's coach going to program today? Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Whereas if it's just almost exactly the same session as last week, then it's less palatable for some athletes, I think.
That would, I guess, really boil down to then the coach's ownership of making sure that he or she fully understands what their athlete wants. And because the thing is, it's like in a class environment, I can only imagine, Jordan, that like you have to take all these variables, as in, I think you kind of have to get it a little bit more to the enjoyable side of things, because you want people keep turning up week on week, so their progression will be slower. But you have to still make sure they are progressing. And I think that comes then across to making sure you explain to all the coaches below you, and then all the coaches can explain to the members about the phases that you're in. So as you mentioned there, about like a power phase, cool. What are we going to do in this power phase? What might we be taking out of our normal training? How will it benefit them? And then how will we go into the next phase? Because I think if people can see, if we're taking, say, CrossFit out, how are we going to bring it back in if we're going into, say, this power phase? And I think that's where it does stem down to the coach and their way to, communicate with their members or their athletes to make sure that they have buy-in, so that if it is boring, that people can kind of endure boring for, say, 6 to 8 weeks, because they know at the end of the 8 weeks they're going to be a more powerful athlete. So when they go back into the CrossFit, they say, cool, this is now where I'm going to see my fruits of the boring work. But it's when I think it's not clear and you're like, what, I've got to do just 10 by 500 on a row. Why the fuck am I doing that in a class? I can do that on my own. It's like, whoa, okay, here we go. This is then the communication.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's knowing exactly what your audience is or what your athlete is looking for, and then developing the program around that. And I'm not saying that, the only way to do CrossFit training is to make it boring. That is absolutely not what I want to try and get across. And you used a really good example there of how I put that into classes. So, the classes that I program with are structured. Obviously, they do contain, elements of progressive overload quite heavily, and that's always something that's at the forefront of my mind when I'm programming. However, you do need to consider that this audience, or this, the clientele coming to these classes, are looking for, at the end of the day, a good workout as well, something that's fun, and maybe aren't taking it quite as seriously. And that's not to undermine them. There are a lot of people that come to classes and take their training very, very seriously, and they absolutely can, but maybe not taking it quite as seriously as someone, let's say, who's paying for bespoke programming and has a very definitive goal at the end of that, and they have something that they want to train for. And I think with that, with that secondary athlete in mind, it's my job there to explain, okay, well, you might not enjoy your training quite as much for the next 6 weeks or so. You might find it a little bit boring. You might think that there are some parts missing from this, but there aren't. There's reason behind this, and there's a reason why you need to endure this. But for the class athlete, there isn't that opportunity to allow them to understand that. And you've got to realize there's a lot of drop-ins. There's people coming into that class maybe for the first time, and they just want a good workout. And it's just identifying the needs of that athlete or for that community, whilst making sure that there is a balance there between it being still progressive. Like at the moment, for example, at WIT, we're in a strength phase, and these guys will be doing overhead squats for the next 6 or so weeks, and each strength part of their workout on a Monday, for example, will look almost identical. It'll be a small tweak in the sense that maybe there's more load or more volume, but there won't be a lot more than that in that strength phase. The workout, however, will change week in, week out, and that's just something I will allow. Maybe if I wanted absolutely everyone in that class to be a better athlete, there could be some real specific changes, and it could look really, really similar. But again, that's not going to apply to one person any better than it would another. Everyone's needs can be very different there. So keeping that level of variation makes a lot more sense for a class program and for that format than it would for, say, an individual athlete. If I was training just you, Rob, for example, there would be nowhere near as much variation week in, week out, because I'd know exactly what I'm trying to progress on a weekly basis, rather than just give you a workout and make sure that some things are progressing. It would be really, really, down to a T, everything is accounted for and everything is progressive. And I think that just comes down again to identifying what their needs are and what the audience is that you're programming for.
Awesome. Yeah, love it. I think that's the take, basically. Like, if you're listening to this wondering how you should build it in, that's it in a nutshell for who it's for and what are the other variables you've got to juggle. Because I think the other thing that goes with classes is that there's such a variety of limiters. So you're going to have people who are fitness limited, who are strength limited, who are mobility limited. So you've got to try and stimulate everything that everybody needs, which is always a big balancing act. And yeah, very challenging from a programming point of view, combined with getting your progressive overload in and keeping it stimulating, fun and enjoyable for however many people are in the class. So it's, no easy task to get all of that in.
So you've obviously talked about how hard it can be, but I think as long as you identify that, okay, I need to work on X, and give yourself the time and the ability to progress that skill or monostructural cardio, whatever, then that's what you need to do. How have you found, so obviously you guys have started dabbling more in Hyrox. Now, obviously there's a lot more measures. It's a lot clearer of a test. Have you found now providing Hyrox classes, is that easier to program? Are people a lot more willing to do the boring work, seems that you got essentially 8 kilometers of running with the same 8 movements in between or whatever it is? Have you found it easier to talk to, say, a Hyrox athlete about this compared to a CrossFitter? And what would you say is maybe some of the traits, apart from obviously just enduring boring stuff, that a CrossFitter could take from a Hyrox athlete?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And yeah, as you said, Hyrox is fundamentally just more measurable as a sport in comparison to CrossFit, which makes it a little bit easier to program, I think. But also getting the buy-in from athletes as well is a little bit easier when considering, your monostructural work and your repeated work and stuff that shows clear progressions. It's a little bit easier to get that buy-in from an athlete. So yeah, I think from talking to people that, compete in Hyrox, they often come from a background of running, or, triathlon or stuff like that, which I think they're already in that headspace of, things aren't always going to be interesting. Sometimes this session is going to suck a little bit. So that it's a little bit of an easier buy-in in terms of putting that into your classes. So we run some Hyrox classes at WIP now. It's again still striking that balance of, as much as this is something that we have put on for Hyrox competitors, it's also still put into a class environment. Still needs to be fun. It still needs to strike that balance of being, something that a drop-in could come into and be like, oh yeah, that was a really good, fun workout as well. So there's still that balance there to be struck. But I think CrossFitters coming into Hyrox tend to find it quite boring just because of that, not because of the fact that it's measurable, but because of the fact that they know what's going to come up every time. And I think CrossFitters sort of innately love the idea of the unknown and not really knowing what they're up against, which is really cool. Don't get me wrong. But I just don't think the way to train for that is it being unknown as well. If that makes sense. Like there's as I said before, there's certainly a need for it to be really varied and very very diverse at times. But if that's year round, it kind of loses its effect. And I'll sort of touch on sort of sports specificity a little bit as well, because you recently did a podcast on this, and it was one of my favorite ones actually. And I think the thing with CrossFit is it's very hard to make it specific without it being useless, in the sense that sports specificity is really, really good until you're not actually progressing at that sport specifically. I don't actually know if that made sense.
It does, yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is, if you are not putting enough time into progressing a certain element of that sport, you're not progressing at all, or very, very minimally. And therefore, it's no longer specific because it's no longer training. It's just doing movements.
Yeah,
So
working out.
So I think CrossFit is quite a weird one, where sports specificity can be a lot less specific to therefore make it more specific. Whereas in something like running, for example, if you want to get better at running, your best bet is to spend as much time running as you can. Whereas doing more CrossFit, or doing as much CrossFit as you can, and I say CrossFit in inverted commas in the sense that, if we talk about really varied workouts or really funky, cool looking workouts, that's not always going to make you a better CrossFitter long term. You need to develop certain areas of athleticism to then just become a better CrossFitter, and then eventually tie them all in.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Totally,
I
think
totally
the way
agree.
I think about this is
Go on.
basically it can be varied without being random, if that makes sense. So you need to do a lot of different things, but it doesn't mean you just do them at like willy-nilly and just, like you said, chuck shit against the wall and see what sticks. You need to touch a lot of different bases to be good at the sport overall, but it doesn't mean you do it without thought, and you can't violate the principle of progressive overload. Because there are so many things to be good at, we need to be nudging your capacity in each of those areas forwards constantly. And the randomness means like it's a stab in the dark. So if your limiter in CrossFit is whatever, let's say, muscle ups, you might be doing a lot of muscle up volume spread through the week, but you're never in any one session pushing your bar muscle up capacity. So 100 muscle ups in 7 days is infinitely easier than 100 muscle ups in 1 day. And it might take 100 muscle ups in 1 day to actually improve your muscle up capacity. So this is what I was saying earlier about it's just so difficult to keep tabs on all these different areas of the game to keep progressively overloading them, which is ultimately what makes you better as a CrossFit athlete, rather than competing all the time, which is the classic just doing relentless WODs. It's like, say, five-a-side's another good example. You can play five-a-side matches every week, and if you're rusty, you'll get back to a level of performance, but you're not going to be getting much better at football itself compared to if you were training for the same amount of time per week. If you had a really good coach who figured out what was limiting your football performance and you spent an hour a week on those drills versus an hour a week just playing a game trying to win, you would become a better footballer faster with the training rather than the competing. And CrossFit, it's a harder thing to separate in your mind because we say workout, and workout can mean training, but it can also mean competing. And we're not clearly distinguishing the two enough for people to appreciate which ones are developmental and which ones are just expressing the fitness you already have.
This kind of reminds me of that early episode we did of training versus competing versus testing. And it's like, we've been talking about this for the longest, and it's like, it's so easy to get pulled into the competing side of things, because even in the class environment, you want to compete against your mate, or you know what score they got this morning in the class, we've got to try and beat that. And all these kind of things reminds me of how like CrossFit kind of started. And like on CrossFit.com, you had your workout of the day. That's what you all put your scores up. You do your thing. That's how it started. But then you notice when the sport become a proper sport, people started to program properly. They started to pull things out. Okay, what do I need to work on? Strength, power, endurance. I'm taking out some of these things. I'm now going to get some specifics in my gymnastics that needs work because I'm seeing some glaring holes. Or then it might be the actual pairing of movements together. I need to get good at going from one to the other. Like when you mentioned about like triathletes, like a lot of triathletes will pair swimming with bike or bike with running, because they got to be able to transition from one to the other. They don't often do all three back to back because one is setting that up. It's quite hard to do. But for most triathletes, it's cool. They can go from one to the other. And I just feel as the sport has evolved, so has the programming, but there's still a lot of old school mindset that's lingering around, because CrossFit itself, I think, is known to be high intensity, that's constantly varied, and that's what's like the main points. And we talk about this on episodes where you got all those key physical traits, and we focus on such a small amount of them that we forget about all the others. And it's all the others that kind of help bring the rest of it all up to make you an actual CrossFitter that's good at multiple things, not just really good at Metcons.
Yeah. And I think there's this weird sort of, it's not weird, it's a quite understandable fixation on Metcons, actually. I think especially when you're very early coming into a sport, because it is very fun. It's it's so different. People rave on about, and I love it. Don't get me wrong. I think CrossFit is a great thing for the general public to get involved in, when done sensibly, and when supervised well in terms of a programmer or a coach. I think it's fantastic because it does expose the everyday person or someone that wants to get into CrossFit to so many different ways of training and variations of movements that maybe you wouldn't come across normally, and it really keeps you stimulated. I think it's great. But I think when looking at really trying to be at the top of your game, or really trying to push to the next level, there's this underlying ignorance or sort of forgetting of general athleticism, and being a good athlete, or just athletic, is going to be a really, really big part of your progression. And I think sometimes it's very hard to develop overall athleticism in mixed modal training, because there's, as we said before, so much variation. There's probably going to be a loss of frequency. There's going to be less time enabled to develop that given part of athleticism. So stripping it back a little bit, and just retouching on the mixed modal stuff every now and again, or at the end of a block, is a really overlooked way of training nowadays. And I think it's our job as coaches, whether that be in classes, or especially I think in bespoke programming, or even writing a general program, to make sure that there is that element of, we need to get you better as an athlete, and get you better performing in all of these specific modes of training, rather than just giving you everything and seeing if you're pretty good at one thing. If you look at the best athletes in CrossFit or whatever, they almost always come from a background of sport, and that will normally be like a single mode sport. A lot of CrossFitters come from gymnastics background, or they'll come from a weightlifting background, and that's why they excel at that. And a lot of endurance athletes as well will show those qualities. And I think that's one thing to remember. If you know, people at the top level have spent that much time just developing themselves as a single modality athlete, there's probably reason behind that. There's probably a reason why they're so good at picking up all these other things now. It's because they've allowed themselves the time and given themselves the training sort of energy time as well to develop that facet of training before going into trying to put everything together. It's really hard to do that unless you're athletic and you're good at all of these things and you have, you know, good proprioception and speed and endurance and all of those things that are sort of qualities built from single mode training. To then put them together is very difficult.
Amen. Cool, mate. Let's give some practical takeaways to the listeners. So if they've heard this, they've been inspired, they're like, right, I want to do more single modality stuff, I want to do some more monostructural, what would be the first action steps you would advise for them to go about building this in?
So I think it depends on how they're being programmed, and obviously this stretches across like different kinds of athletes. If you're sort of a gym member, you maybe go to a box and you're programming, you're seeing that the work is maybe just a little bit randomized, a little bit arbitrary. I think one thing to do is just give yourself a couple of things each week that you can repeat yourself, and these can be really, really simple. You don't have to, you know, be super clever with how you implement them. Let's say you're just not very fit. Pick an erg or pick an, you know, it could be a run or whatever. Pick one that maybe you're not very good at, but is easily accessible in the sense that, you know, if it's muscle ups, for example, and you can't do muscle ups, they're going to be quite hard to just teach yourself to do muscle ups. But if it's something like fitness, or, you know, you're just not very powerful, pick something that you can easily implement into your training and progress it each week. And this could just be 1 or 2 sessions that you put in yourself, so that you can see clear progression. Because if your workout every day is something completely different and you're not having a chance to measure and see how that moves along, you're never really going to know if you're getting better until maybe one day you'll do a workout. Be like, okay, I felt a bit better there. But then again, it's anecdotal. It's based off of personal whim. There's no data to back that up. So give yourself a data point and give yourself something that you can measure week in, week out. And that could be as simple as, you know, a 10 by 500 in a rower. Maybe one week you do it with a certain speed, and then the week after that you're trying to get that speed down. And when you plateau, change it up. You know, make it 10 by 750 or whatever. You know, that's a miserable session. But you know what I mean? Like just chip away at it until it becomes, you get to the point where you can't improve it anymore, and then change one thing, and then try and improve that again. That's, you know, the absolute bread and butter of progressive overload. It's just exhausting one method of progression until you can't anymore, and changing it and exhausting that again. So that's really easily implemented. I think if you are following a generic program, it kind of falls into the same category where, you know, there hopefully is some level of structure where you've got that progressive overload already built into your program. But if you're starting to notice that maybe there isn't, and your workouts are just completely randomized, probably time to look for a different program. Yeah, would be my first bit of advice there. Having said that, most generic programs do have that, and I think all the successful ones, what I hope anyway, are implementing that to a degree. If you feel like there are certain weaknesses again there where you're just not seeing that that quick progression or progression at a rate that you think is reasonable, then add that in. And it could be at, you know, the sacrifice of one of those sessions per week that are pre-programmed, and you change that for something that you want to see more measured success on, and implement that in yourself. If it's with a bespoke coach and you're getting programming one-to-one from another coach, again, this is where you'd almost definitely you definitely should be seeing that already. And if it's not, it's down to, you know, having a conversation with your coach to make sure that they can identify that as well, and they can, you know, really clearly implement that into your program without you having to do the thinking work. So it's your coach should be doing that already, and if not, again, it should be maybe a conversation to see how you can really push that forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think hit the nail on the head there in that we did a whole episode called Pimp Your Progressive Overload, where we talk about this a little bit. And I think most people would be astonished at how long they could do the same session and keep making progress. Like if you do 10 by 500 meters on the rower with 60 seconds rest, you can do that for months, potentially years, and still keep shaving bits off if you're willing to take the pain. And there is no hiding place in those sorts of sessions because it's pure hard data. And when you're looking at the rower and you know your pace is slipping, you can always find a little bit more, with a few caveats around like fueling and what other training you're doing in the week. But it's basically, do you have the tolerance, the appetite to be that accountable and that progressive? Same goes with even strength sessions. If you pick a rep range, like sets and reps, you can keep chipping. For most people, until you're like very elite, most people could do like a 4x8 with a consistent rest period and keep nudging it up. It might mean putting 1.5, 2.5 kilos on one set for one rep per week, but overall big picture macro trend, most people could still continue making progress in that way for a really long time, but it is a little bit on the boring side. So again, like find your balance, find your appetite for novelty. But if you're really serious about getting good at one specific thing, do the thing, and then surprise, you'll probably get better at it.
Yeah.
I love that, mate. I think it's a nice way to wrap that up because there's some real good takeaways. And I know going into my own training now, I'm going to have a bit more monostructural stuff and kind of start to work on some of my base level fitness. Not go balls deep into triathlon again, but maybe I'll have a little bit of monostructural work to kind of work on my glaring weakness. But mate, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. That was a fun episode.
Where can listeners find more about you, Jordan?
Bloody, I'm pretty rubbish on social media actually, so this is probably the point where everyone plugs their Instagram. But unless you just want to see, a picture of my shoes every 6 weeks, then you probably shouldn't follow that. Obviously, down at WIT, where I do all of my coaching and do all of the programming for the classes, is probably the best way to sort of see and get a feel of my coaching. So yeah, by all means, come and have a drop in at WIT London if you haven't already. Or yeah, I mean, you can obviously reach out to me on social media. I think it's Jordan_Shelley. I think it might be a dot, but I'm sure you guys can link it in
We'll link it. We'll link it in the description.
So yeah, if you do have any questions, I'll obviously happily answer it there. But I don't put out a lot of content for full transparency. So yeah, you might be disappointed if you're scrolling through my page.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate your time. Have a great day, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, mate, for coming on. That was quite funny. I mean, as you kind of said at the start, like from obviously meeting Jordan in the early days of his career of being a trainer, and then seeing how much you've developed over the years, and obviously now the head coach of WIT, it's massive. And again, some really insightful nuggets there, some real good takeaways for people. And even like myself, just hearing some of those bits, it's just nice to be reminded of maybe kind of scaling certain things back and keeping things a bit more monostructural, keeping the one thing the main goal and focusing on that one thing. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on. Really do appreciate your time. And as always, listeners, we really appreciate you week in, week out tuning in. And thank you for sharing. The podcast is growing and it's growing really well, but we would love it to grow even more, obviously. We always want that a little bit more, right? Progressive overload. So if you've got someone you want to share the episodes with, whether it's this one or previous ones, we would love for you to share it. Put it on social medias. Tag us at lunge.lift. Tag us both on, the social media, whatever one you're on. And head over to YouTube. And you can support the podcast in a nice free way. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Help us grow that as well. We would really appreciate that. So as always, thank you very much for your time. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.